The wedding photographer caught it on film, the exact moment I married the wrong sister, but I wouldn't see that photograph until it was far, far too late. They say twins can sense each other's pain across any distance, that they share a connection beyond what normal siblings experience. What they don't tell you is that some twins can steal each other's lives. I met Olivia Chen at a climate change conference in Seattle where I was presenting my research on coral reef degradation. She was standing alone by the floor-to-ceiling windows, silhouetted against the rain-soaked city, and when she turned to look at me, I felt something shift in my chest, the kind of recognition that makes you believe in past lives or destiny or whatever romantic notion you need to explain why a stranger's face can feel like coming home. Dr. Nathan Cross. Her voice was honey over gravel. Your presentation on the Great Barrier Reef was devastating. In the best way. That's either a compliment or you enjoy watching grown men cry about dying coral. She laughed, and the sound cut through the ambient noise of 200 marine biologists networking over cheap wine. Both, maybe. I'm Olivia. I run an NGO focused on ocean conservation funding. I think we should talk about your work. We talked for 4 hours. Then 4 more over dinner. Then through the night at a bar that overlooked Elliott Bay, where she told me about growing up in San Francisco with parents who expected perfection and a twin sister who always delivered it. Evelyn was always the golden child, Olivia said, her third gin and tonic making her words loose and honest. Straight A's, medical school, married a surgeon, gave my parents the grandchildren they wanted. I'm the disappointment who chose saving fish over saving humans. Saving ecosystems saves humans, I said. Tell that to my mother. She smiled, but there was something sharp behind it. Evelyn's perfect. Always has been. Sometimes I think God made 2 of us just so I could see what I should have been. I should have heard the bitterness. Should have recognized the warning. Instead, I fell in love. We dated long distance for 8 months, me in Miami at the university, her in San Francisco running the Pacific Conservation Alliance. Our relationship existed in airports and hotel rooms and stolen weekends where the world contracted to just the 2 of us. It was intense, compressed, almost desperately romantic in the way relationships are when you know you only have 48 hours before reality separates you again. I met Evelyn at Olivia's birthday dinner in San Francisco. They were identical in the way that makes strangers do double takes, same high cheekbones, same almond-shaped eyes, same waterfall of black hair. But where Olivia dressed in vintage band t-shirts and ripped jeans, Evelyn wore a cream silk blouse and pearls. Where Olivia laughed too loud and gestured wildly when she talked, Evelyn sat with perfect posture and smiled with her mouth closed. So you're the marine biologist, Evelyn said, extending a hand that felt cold despite the warm restaurant. Olivia talks about you constantly. It's nice to finally meet the men who convinced my sister that love is real. She convinced me first, I said. Something flickered across Evelyn's face, too quick to read, gone before I could interpret it. The dinner was fine. Pleasant. Forgettable in the way most family gatherings are forgettable. Olivia's parents asked about my research with polite disinterest. Evelyn's husband Marcus, a cardiac surgeon with the personality of a stethoscope, discussed hospital politics. Their 2 children, 8 and 6, played on iPads and ignored the adults. But I caught Evelyn watching me twice. Not the casual glances of someone making conversation. Something more focused. Calculating. Your sister seems nice, I told Olivia that night. Evelyn's perfect, Olivia said, and that sharpness was back. Just ask my parents. 6 months later, I proposed on a research vessel off the coast of Belize, surrounded by the most vibrant coral reef system I'd ever documented. Olivia cried and said yes, and for one perfect moment, everything in my carefully ordered scientific life made beautiful, chaotic sense. The wedding was in San Francisco, because that's where Olivia's family was, where the money was, where her parents could invite 300 of their closest friends to watch their disappointment daughter finally do something right. Evelyn was the maid of honor. I'm so happy for you both, she told me during the rehearsal dinner, her hand resting on my arm just a moment too long. Olivia deserves this. She's been alone for so long. The wedding itself was a blur of white roses and string quartets and Olivia looking so beautiful in her grandmother's vintage lace dress that I forgot to breathe when she walked down the aisle. We said our vows. We kissed. 287 people applauded. The photographer caught everything. including the moment during the reception when I danced with Evelyn, tradition, apparently, for the groom to dance with the maid of honor, and she whispered in my ear, "Take care of her, Nathan. She's more fragile than she pretends to be." "I know," I said. "No." Evelyn pulled back to look at me, and her eyes were strange. Intense. "You really don't." Then the song ended, and Olivia reclaimed me, and the night dissolved into champagne and terrible dancing and the warm glow of believing I'd just made the best decision of my life. Our honeymoon was 3 weeks in Indonesia, diving with manta rays and documenting reef systems for my research. Olivia was certified to dive, and we spent our days underwater in that peculiar silence where the only sound is your own breathing and the world feels alien and beautiful and utterly still. On the surface, though, something had changed. Olivia was distant. Distracted. She'd stare at her phone for long minutes, then put it away without explanation. She started getting headaches that kept her in our bungalow while I dove alone. She picked fights over nothing, where we'd eat dinner, whether we should extend the trip, why I'd taken so many photos of the reef and so few of her. "Are you okay?" I asked on our last night, watching her push rice around her plate without eating. "Fine. Just tired." But she wasn't looking at me. Marriage is an adjustment, right? That's normal. It didn't feel normal. But I was 34 years old and had never been married before. What did I know about normal? We moved into a house in Coral Gables, halfway between my university and her work, though Olivia had started working remotely more often, taking video calls from home instead of going to the San Francisco office. The Pacific Conservation Alliance was expanding, she explained. She needed to be available at odd hours for international donors. I believed her because marriage is built on trust, and I had no reason not to trust the woman I'd just vowed to spend my life with. The first crack appeared 3 months after the wedding. I came home early from the lab, equipment malfunction had cancelled my afternoon lectures, and found Olivia on the back patio, crying into her phone. "I can't do this anymore," she was saying. "It's too hard. Every time I look at him I feel like I'm going to." She saw me and went silent, terror flashing across her face. "I have to go. Livy." I stepped outside. "What's wrong?" "Who was that?" "Nothing. My mother." She wiped her eyes roughly. "She's being impossible about Thanksgiving plans." That didn't sound like nothing. Well, it was nothing. Suddenly she was angry, defensive in a way that felt disproportionate to the question. "Can I not have a private conversation with my mother without you interrogating me?" I held up my hands. "I'm not interrogating. I'm worried." "Don't be." She stood up, brushing past me into the house. "I'm fine. Everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine. Olivia stopped diving with me. Stopped asking about my research. Stopped reaching for me in bed at night. She started taking long walks alone, disappearing for hours without explanation. When I asked where she'd been, she'd snap that I was being controlling, that she needed space, that marriage didn't mean ownership. I started feeling like I was living with a stranger who happened to look like my wife. For months after the wedding, I found the pill bottle. I was looking for aspirin in Olivia's medicine cabinet. We still hadn't fully combined our bathroom supplies, when I found a prescription bottle with someone else's name on it, Evelyn Chin Morrison. The medication was lorazepam, an anti-anxiety drug. The bottle was nearly empty. Why did my wife have her sister's prescription medication? I took a photo of the bottle label. Then I did what I'd sworn I'd never do, I invaded my wife's privacy. Her laptop was in the study, closed but not locked. I knew her password because we'd promised each other transparency, no secrets, the kind of naive trust that belongs to newlyweds who still believe love conquers everything. Her email was open. The most recent message was from someone named Dr. Patricia Wendell, dated 2 days earlier. "Olivia, I understand your reluctance to continue our sessions, but given the complexity of your situation, I strongly encourage you to reconsider. Identity issues of this nature rarely resolve without professional intervention. Please call my office." Identity issues. I scrolled through her inbox, my hands shaking, that sick feeling building in my stomach that tells you you're about to discover something that will change everything. There were dozens of emails from Dr. Wendell going back 6 months, before the wedding. Subject lines like, twin dynamics and self-concept, and coping with comparative identity disorder, and managing resentment toward siblings. Then I found the email folder labeled E. Inside were 1,847 messages between Olivia and Evelyn, starting 3 weeks after our honeymoon. I read them chronologically, watching my marriage decompose in real time. Evie, I don't know if I can do this. He's not who I thought he was. Give it time, Liv. Marriage is hard for everyone at first. But what if I made a mistake? What if I'm not actually in love with him? You're just scared. That's normal. Then, a month later. I keep thinking about what you said at the wedding. About how you understood why I chose him. I shouldn't have said that. Forget I mentioned it. But you did understand, didn't you? You felt it too. No response for 3 days. Then. Olivia, don't do this. Do what? Acknowledge that we both know the truth. There is no truth. You're married. I'm married. That's the only truth that matters. I scrolled faster, watching the messages grow more intense, more desperate. I dreamed about you last night. About us. About what could have been if things were different. Stop. Why? Because you're afraid to admit you feel the same way. Because you're my sister. Because this is insane. We're not really sisters, though. Not biologically. Not where it counts. I stopped reading, my brain unable to process what I was seeing. Not biologically sisters. I searched adoption in the email archive. 47 results. I opened the oldest one, dated 9 years earlier, long before I'd met either of them. Evie, I found the papers in Mom's office. The adoption papers. Did you know? Did you know I wasn't really their daughter? Oh my God, Olivia. I had no idea. They never told me. 24 years and they never told me I wasn't really their biological child. That you were the real daughter and I was just, what? The spare? The consolation prize? You're not a spare. You're my sister. Biology doesn't change that. Doesn't it though? Doesn't it explain everything? Why they always loved you more? Why you were always the golden child and I was always the disappointment? I sat back in the desk chair, the laptop screen blurring in front of me. Olivia was adopted. Evelyn was the biological daughter. And based on the recent messages, they'd both developed feelings that went far beyond sisterly affection, feelings they were both terrified of but couldn't seem to stop expressing. But there was something else. Something worse. I scrolled back to the emails from right after the wedding. He noticed something's wrong. I'm not good at pretending anymore. Then stop pretending. Tell him the truth. I can't. It would destroy him. It's going to destroy him anyway when he finds out. When he finds out what? 3 days of silence. Then. Olivia, please call me. We need to talk about this in person. What happened at the wedding was a mistake. We were both drunk and emotional and it never should have happened. But it did happen, and now we need to figure out how to fix this before someone gets hurt. Someone's already hurt, Evie. Me. I've been hurt my whole life, being second best to you. And for one night, I got to be the one who mattered. I got to be you. You are you. Not me. Am I? Because I think we both know the truth. I think we both know what happened that night. I stopped breathing. What happened that night? I scrolled frantically through more messages, looking for context, for explanation, for something that would make this make sense, then I found it. An email from Olivia to Evelyn, sent at 2:47 a.m. on our wedding night. I can't believe we did that. I can't believe you let me. But God, Evie, for 3 hours I got to be perfect. I got to be you. And he never knew. He never even suspected. The room tilted. No. No, 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 no. I opened a new browser tab with shaking hands and searched for our wedding photographer's website. Found the gallery. Entered the password. Scrolled through 847 photos of what I thought was the happiest day of my life. There. Photo number 284, me dancing with Evelyn during the reception, her hand on my shoulder, her face close to mine. Photo number 285, Olivia in the background, watching us dance, her expression strange. Hurt. Angry. Photo number 286, the cake cutting ceremony. Me feeding Olivia a bite of cake, both of us laughing. Except. I zoomed in on the image, my heart hammering. The woman in the wedding dress, my wife, was wearing Evelyn's pearl earrings. The ones she'd worn to dinner. The ones Olivia had never liked because they were too stuffy, too mom-approved. I pulled up more photos. Photo number 312, the first dance. My arms around Olivia. But the way she held herself, too straight, too formal. Not Olivia's loose, comfortable posture. Photo number 341, the vows. I'd memorized every word of what Olivia was supposed to say. But looking at the video timestamp, the speech had been 2 minutes shorter than we'd rehearsed. Photo number 389, the exit. Me and Olivia running through a shower of rose petals to the car. But her smile was wrong. Too measured. Too controlled. I ran to the bathroom and vomited until there was nothing left but bile and the sickening realization of what I was seeing. At some point during our wedding, maybe during the reception, maybe earlier, Olivia and Evelyn had switched places. I hadn't married Olivia Chen. I'd married her twin sister. And I'd been living with an imposter for 4 months. I sat on the bathroom floor until my legs went numb, trying to make reality align with what I thought I knew. Identical twins. Same face, same voice, same body. But different mannerisms, different personalities, different souls. How had I not noticed? Because I'd been on a honeymoon, then adjusting to married life, and when your wife acts different, you attribute it to stress or adjustment or the normal evolution of a relationship. You don't suspect you're literally living with a different person. I pulled myself off the floor and went back to the laptop. The emails continued past the wedding. I can't keep doing this, Evie. Being her. Pretending to be her. He's going to figure it out. Then tell him. Tell him what we did and face the consequences. I can't. He'll hate me. He'll hate both of us. He should hate us. We deserve it. Wait. If these emails were between Olivia and Evelyn, and Olivia was living in my house, then. I read more carefully, paying attention to the signatures, the linguistic patterns, the perspectives. Oh God. The emails weren't between sisters planning a deception. They were between sisters who had already deceived me. Olivia, the real Olivia, the woman I'd proposed to, was still in San Francisco. Evelyn, Dr. Evelyn Chen Morrison, cardiac surgeon, married mother of 2, was living in my house in Coral Gables, pretending to be her twin sister. I'd spent 4 months married to the wrong woman. The front door opened. Nathan. Her voice, Evelyn's voice, though I'd been calling it Olivia's for months. You home? I brought Thai food. I closed the laptop and walked out of the study on legs that felt disconnected from my body. She was in the kitchen, unpacking takeout containers, wearing yoga pants and one of my university t-shirts. She looked exactly like the woman I'd married. Exactly like the woman I'd fallen in love with in Seattle. But she wasn't. Hey, she said, smiling. I got your favorite, drunken noodles with extra basil. You okay? You look pale. Where's Olivia? My voice came out flat, dead. Her smile froze. What? Olivia. Your sister. The woman I actually married. Where is she? The takeout container slipped from her hand and hit the counter, spilling noodles across the granite. Nathan. How long? I asked. How long were you planning to keep this going? Another month. A year. Forever. Please, let me explain. Explain. The word came out as a roar. You've been living in my house, sleeping in my bed, pretending to be your sister for 4 months. What possible explanation makes that okay? Evelyn, because that's who she was, that's who she'd always been, started crying. It was supposed to be just the wedding night. Just a few hours so Olivia could deal with something. Then I was going to switch back and she'd take over and you'd never know. Deal with what? She had a panic attack. Right before the ceremony. A bad one. She locked herself in the bridal suite and said she couldn't do it, couldn't go through with it, couldn't walk down that aisle in front of all those people. Evelyn's words came faster, desperate. I thought I was helping. I thought I could just get her through the ceremony and then she'd be okay. So you put on her dress and married me. It was supposed to be 20 minutes. Just the vows and the pictures, and then we'd switch back during the reception. But Olivia, she couldn't calm down. She took some of my anxiety medication and it knocked her out completely. By the time she woke up, the reception was over and you and I were in the car heading to the hotel and I didn't know what to do. I stared at her. So you just kept going. Through the wedding night. Through the honeymoon. Through 4 months of marriage. I was going to tell you the next morning. I swear I was. But then you looked at me like I was the most important person in the world, and I realized. She stopped, fresh tears streaming down her face. I realized I didn't want to be Evelyn anymore. I wanted to be the woman you loved. Even if that woman was supposed to be someone else. The kitchen was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and my own ragged breathing. Where's the real Olivia now? I asked. San Francisco. Living in my house with Marcus and the kids. She's pretending to be you. Evelyn nodded miserably. We were going to switch back. We tried. But every time we made plans, I'd think about losing you and I couldn't do it. And Olivia, she'd been in love with my life for so long. The perfect house, the successful husband, the beautiful children. She finally got to live it. So you both just stole each other's lives. I know how it sounds. You don't. You can't possibly know how this sounds because you're not the person who just discovered his entire marriage is a lie. I grabbed my keys off the counter. Where are you going? San Francisco. To meet my actual wife. Nathan, please. Don't. I held up a hand. Don't say my name. Don't touch me. Don't act like you have any right to ask me for anything. I walked out, leaving her crying in a kitchen full of spilled noodles and broken trust. The flight to San Francisco took 5 hours. I spent them reading through more emails, piecing together the full scope of the deception. Olivia and Evelyn had been planning this for weeks before the wedding. Not exactly planning, more like fantasizing, playing a dangerous game of what if. What if they could trade lives for a day? What if Evelyn could experience passion instead of a stale marriage to a man who treated her like expensive furniture? What if Olivia could experience stability instead of always being the disappointing daughter? The wedding had been the perfect opportunity. Identical dresses, identical hairstyles, everyone drunk and happy and not looking too carefully at which twin was which. It was supposed to be temporary. A one-night adventure. A story they'd laugh about when they were old. But then Evelyn had felt something she hadn't felt in her 12-year marriage to Marcus, desire. Real, consuming, desperate desire. And once she'd tasted it, she couldn't give it up. And Olivia, neurotic, anxious, always second-best Olivia, had discovered that living as perfect Evelyn meant their parents finally looked at her with pride instead of disappointment. So they'd made a choice. They'd kept the swap going. 1 day became 1 week, became 1 month, became 4 months of sustained, elaborate fraud. I landed in San Francisco at 11 p.m. and drove straight to Evelyn's house in Pacific Heights, except it wasn't Evelyn's house anymore, was it? It was Olivia's. The house was massive, 3 stories of pristine white Victorian architecture that probably cost $4 million. Lights were on in the upstairs windows. A Tesla sat in the driveway next to a BMW. I rang the doorbell and waited. A man answered, tall, silver-haired, radiating the kind of confidence that comes from regularly holding human hearts in your hands. Dr. Marcus Morrison, cardiac surgeon, who had no idea his wife of 12 years had abandoned him 4 months ago. Can I help you? His voice was clipped, annoyed at being disturbed so late. Is Evelyn home? She's putting the kids to bed. Who are you? Nathan Cross. Olivia's husband. I watched his face carefully. Or I thought I was. Turns out I married the wrong twin. Marcus's expression didn't change. I have no idea what you're talking about. Really? Because your wife has been living in my house in Miami for 4 months. Which means the woman upstairs pretending to be your wife is actually my wife's sister. Unless you already knew that. Something flickered across his face, not surprise, not confusion. Guilt. You knew, I said slowly. Oh my God, you knew. Get out of my house. How long? I pushed past him into the foyer, and he grabbed my arm. I will call the police. Call them. Please. I would love to explain to the police how 4 people have been committing marriage fraud for 4 months. Footsteps on the stairs. Marcus. Who's at the? Olivia appeared on the landing. She was wearing silk pajamas and Evelyn's pearl earrings, her hair pulled back in a style she'd never worn before. She looked healthy. Rested. Happy. Until she saw me. Nathan. My name came out as a whisper. Hello, wife. I shook off Marcus's grip. Surprise. She came down the stairs slowly, like a prisoner approaching execution. Up close, I could see the differences I'd missed for months. Olivia was slightly thinner than Evelyn, her eyes more guarded, her smile more hesitant. This was the woman I'd proposed to on a research vessel in Belize. This stranger. I can explain, she said. Everyone wants to explain. Nobody wants to admit what they actually did. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Then how was it supposed to happen? My voice echoed in the expensive foyer. Because from where I'm standing, you and your sister decided to steal each other's lives and didn't bother to tell the people whose lives you were stealing. Olivia's face crumpled. I had a panic attack. Right before the wedding. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't imagine walking down that aisle with everyone watching me. Evie said she'd help, just get me through the ceremony, and then you decided you liked her life better than your own. She flinched like I'd hit her. It wasn't like that. No. Then what was it like? Explain to me how abandoning your new husband on your wedding night is anything other than the cruelest, most selfish thing a person can do. Marcus cleared his throat. Maybe we should all sit down and discuss this calmly. You don't get to talk, I said without looking at him. You knew your wife had been replaced and you said nothing. That makes you complicit. I didn't know for sure until 2 weeks ago. But you suspected. And you said nothing because you liked Olivia better than Evelyn, didn't you? She was more attentive, more grateful, more willing to play the perfect surgeon's wife. Marcus's silence was answer enough. I turned back to Olivia. Did you ever love me? Or was I just an escape plan from being the disappointing daughter? I did love you. I do love you. But Nathan, you fell in love with an idea of me. The confident, passionate woman who didn't care what anyone thought. That's never been who I really am. That's who I wanted to be, who I pretended to be when we were together. But the real me, her voice broke. The real me is anxious and insecure and terrified of disappointing people. The real me had a panic attack on her wedding day because she realized she'd tricked you into loving someone who didn't exist. So instead of telling me the truth, you let your sister take your place. It was supposed to be temporary. For 4 months. I know. I know it's insane. But every time we tried to switch back, Evie would call me crying, begging for more time because she'd finally found what she'd been missing in her marriage. And I'd look at Marcus and the kids and this beautiful house and realize I finally had what I'd always wanted. So we kept postponing. Postponing. I laughed, and it sounded unhinged. You postponed ending the massive fraud you were committing. What do you want me to say? Olivia's voice rose. That I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I panicked, I'm sorry I let this go on so long, I'm sorry we hurt you. But I won't apologize for finally feeling like I was good enough. Do you know what it's like to spend your entire life being compared to someone who's better than you at everything? To know you're the adopted one, the consolation prize, the daughter they kept because they felt obligated. That doesn't justify. I know it doesn't justify anything. She was crying now, mascara running down her face. But I'm trying to explain why. I'm trying to make you understand what it feels like to be so tired of being yourself that you'd do anything, to be someone else for a while. We stood in that expensive foyer, breathing hard. while Marcus watched like this was a surgery going wrong and he couldn't figure out where to cut. "I want an annulment," I said finally. "From both of you. Because apparently I've been married to 2 different women and I want to be married to exactly 0 women. Nathan. I want you to call Evelyn right now and tell her to pack her things. I want you both to stand in front of a judge and admit what you did. And then I want you both to live with the consequences while I figure out how to put my life back together." Olivia pulled out her phone with shaking hands and dialed. "Evie. He knows. He's here in San Francisco and he knows everything." I could hear Evelyn's voice through the speaker, high and panicked. "We need to end this," Olivia said. "Now. Tonight. Come home." The scandal hit San Francisco society like a tsunami. Twin sisters who'd swapped husbands. A wedding where the bride was actually the maid of honor. 4 months of sustained deception. It had everything the gossip columns loved: wealth, beauty, betrayal, and the kind of psychological dysfunction that makes people feel better about their own messy lives. The San Francisco Chronicle ran a front-page story: "Twin swap, when I do becomes, I'm not who you think I am." Evelyn lost her medical license pending an ethics investigation. Marcus filed for divorce and got full custody of the children. Olivia's NGO fired her for conduct incompatible with organizational values. My annulment was granted after a 10-minute hearing where the judge looked at all of us with barely concealed disgust. "This is the most disturbing case I've seen in 30 years on the bench," she said. "You've made a mockery of marriage, of trust, and of basic human decency. I hope you're all proud of yourselves." We weren't. But pride was the least of what we'd lost. The twins ended up in court-mandated therapy, together, which seemed cruel until their therapist explained that they needed to re-establish healthy boundaries and separate identities. From what I heard through mutual acquaintances, Evelyn moved to Portland and took a job as a medical consultant. No surgery, no patients, just reviewing charts and advising on cases. Olivia moved to Seattle and worked remotely for a small environmental nonprofit, essentially doing the job she'd had before but for a fraction of the pay and none of the prestige. They'd wanted to trade lives, and in the end, they'd both lost the lives they had. As for me, I went back to my coral reefs. Back to the underwater world where things made sense, where symbiosis was about mutual benefit instead of mutual destruction, where the relationships were honest even when they were parasitic. I threw myself into my research with the kind of obsessive focus that worried my colleagues but produced 3 published papers in 6 months. I stopped dating. Stopped trusting. Stopped believing that love was anything other than a shared delusion that lasted until reality intruded. But 6 months after the annulment, I got a letter. It came from Evelyn, forwarded through my lawyer. "Dear Nathan, I don't expect you to read this. I wouldn't, if I were you. But my therapist suggested I write it anyway, so here goes. I stole 4 months of your life. I pretended to be someone I wasn't, lied every time you looked at me, and let you believe you were building a future with someone who didn't exist. There's no apology big enough for that. No penance that makes it right. But I want you to know, those 4 months were real for me. I know that sounds insane. How can something built entirely on lies be real? But every morning I woke up next to you, every dinner we cooked together, every time you talked about your research like it was the most important thing in the world, I wasn't pretending to care. I wasn't pretending to feel something. I fell in love with you, Nathan. The real me, not Olivia, not the woman I was pretending to be. Fell in love with the way you looked at the world. And I hated myself for it because I knew I was stealing something that didn't belong to me. Olivia loves you too, in her way. But she was right about one thing: she spent our relationship pretending to be confident and fearless because that's who she thought you wanted. You fell in love with her performance, not her real self. Which means none of it was real, was it? Not your relationship with her, not your marriage to me. Just 2 women pretending to be someone else and 1 man who deserved better than either of us could give him. I'm writing this from a studio apartment in Portland. I see my kids twice a month under supervised visitation. I work a job I hate. I lost my career, my marriage, my reputation, and my sister. We're still not speaking. But weirdly, I'm more myself than I've ever been. Turns out when you lose everything, you stop pretending. You stop performing. You just exist. And existing is hard and painful and nothing like the life I had before, but at least it's mine. I hope you find someone real, Nathan. Someone who doesn't have to pretend to be worthy of you. Someone who shows up as themselves and lets you love who they actually are. I'm sorry I wasn't that person. I'm sorry Olivia wasn't either. I'm just sorry. Evelyn. I read the letter 3 times, then burned it in my kitchen sink. Not out of anger, I'd burned through the rage months ago, leaving only ash and exhaustion. I burned it because forgiveness wasn't something I was ready to give, and keeping the letter felt like leaving the door open to something that needed to stay permanently closed. A year after the wedding that wasn't, I ran into Marcus Morrison at a marine biology conference in San Diego. He was there with someone from the hospital, and I was presenting research on coral bleaching patterns. We recognized each other across the hotel bar. For a long moment, I thought he'd pretend he hadn't seen me, but then he walked over. Nathan. He nodded. How are you? Surviving. You. Same. He ordered a drink, and we stood in uncomfortable silence. The kids ask about Evelyn sometimes. I don't know what to tell them. The truth, probably. What version? That their mother had a psychological breakdown and traded lives with her twin sister. That their aunt deceived everyone they knew. He shook his head. I tell them Evelyn was sick and needed to go away for a while. Maybe someday I'll tell them the rest. Did you love her? I asked. The real Evelyn. Marcus considered the question. I married her. Built a life with her. Had children with her. But did I love her? He paused. I don't know. Maybe I loved the idea of her, the brilliant surgeon, the perfect wife, the woman who made me look good at hospital fundraisers. Maybe we were both performing for each other and called it marriage. That's depressing. Welcome to long-term relationships. He finished his drink. For what it's worth, I'm sorry you got dragged into our mess. The twins, they've always had this weird codependent thing. I should have seen it coming. Could you have stopped it? No. But I could have warned you. He set down his empty glass. Be careful, Nathan. Of twins, of people who can't tell where they end and someone else begins, of anyone who makes you feel like you're falling in love with a miracle. Miracles don't exist. Just people, all the way down. And people are mostly disappointing. He left, and I sat alone at the bar, thinking about coral reefs. In healthy reefs, species cooperate. Algae photosynthesize and share nutrients with coral polyps. Clownfish protect anemones from predators. Everything has a role, a function, a way of contributing to the ecosystem. But when the water gets too warm, the coral expels the algae it needs to survive. The symbiosis breaks down. The reef bleaches, turns white, dies. That's what had happened to all of us. The ecosystem had gotten too warm, too much pressure, too much pretending. Too much trying to be something we weren't, and everything had collapsed. Evelyn and Olivia had tried to swap lives because they couldn't stand their own. Marcus and I had fallen in love with performances instead of people. We'd all built our relationships on foundations that couldn't hold weight. And when the stress came, a panic attack, a moment of temptation, the weight of years of pretending, everything crumbled. 2 years after the wedding, I got invited to speak at a conference in San Francisco. I almost declined. But my research was important, and I'd spent 2 years avoiding an entire city because of what had happened there. That felt like letting them win. The conference was fine. My presentation went well. I didn't run into anyone from my failed marriage. But on my last night in the city, I went to the hotel where Olivia and I had first stayed together, that weekend when she'd told me about being the disappointing daughter and I'd fallen in love with her brokenness. The bar overlooking Elliott Bay was still there. I ordered gin and tonic, Olivia's drink, and watched the ships move through the harbor. Nathan. I turned. A woman stood behind me, Asian, beautiful, with long black hair and familiar features. But not Olivia. Not Evelyn. Different. I'm sorry, she said. You looked familiar, but I don't think we've met. I'm Jasmine Chen. I was just, she stopped. Wait. Nathan Cross. The marine biologist. Guilty. Oh my God. I heard about what happened. With my cousins. She winced. That's the worst introduction ever. I swear I'm not usually this awkward. Cousins. Olivia and Evelyn. Their dad is my uncle. She sat down uninvited, and I found I didn't mind. The whole family's still not over it. My aunt and uncle basically disowned both of them. There's this huge rift between everyone who thinks what they did was unforgivable and everyone who thinks they were both mentally ill and need compassion. What do you think? Jasmine considered the question. I think they were scared. Of being themselves, of disappointing people, of admitting they'd made mistakes. So they tried to become each other instead of fixing their own lives. She paused. I also think they destroyed a lot of people in the process, including you. So, both things are true. We talked for 2 hours. About family dysfunction, about the pressure of expectations, about what it means to be yourself when everyone wants you to be someone else. Jasmine was a filmmaker working on a documentary about identity and performance. She was funny, self-aware, and refreshingly honest about her own flaws. When she left, she handed me her card. If you're ever in LA, look me up. I'd love to interview you for the documentary, The Other Side of the Twin Swap Story. I don't think I'm ready to be a documentary subject. Fair enough. But the offer stands. For the interview or just coffee. Whatever you're comfortable with. I kept the card. 3 years after the wedding, Olivia reached out. The email was short. Nathan, I'm getting married. To someone real this time, someone I'm not pretending for. I wanted you to know. Not for closure or forgiveness or whatever people say you're supposed to want. Just because you deserve to know that I'm trying to do it right this time. I'm in therapy. I'm on medication. I'm learning how to be okay with being me instead of wishing I was someone else. I hope you're doing okay too. Olivia. I stared at the email for a long time, then typed a response. Olivia, congratulations. I mean that sincerely. I hope you're happy. I hope he knows the real you and loves her anyway. That's all any of us can ask for. Nathan. I meant it. The anger had finally burned itself out, leaving only a kind of distant sadness for what could have been if we'd all been braver, more honest, more willing to be imperfect in front of each other. For years after the wedding, I called Jasmine Chen. This is probably weird, I said when she answered. But I still have your card. And I'm in LA for a conference. And I thought maybe we could get that coffee. Nathan. She sounded pleased. I was wondering if you'd ever call. Yes. Absolutely yes. When are you free? We met at a cafe in Silver Lake. She looked exactly like I remembered, familiar features, but entirely herself. No performance, no pretending. I should tell you something, I said after we'd ordered. I'm terrible at relationships. I fall for people who aren't real. I trust too easily and then withdraw completely when that trust gets violated. I'm probably going to be suspicious of everything you say for months until I'm sure you're not secretly someone else. Jasmine laughed. That's the most honest opening I've ever heard. Okay, my turn, I'm divorced. I have commitment issues. I throw myself into work to avoid dealing with feelings. And my family is objectively insane, as you already know. So we're both disasters. Yep. Want to be disasters together and see what happens. That might be the sanest relationship proposal I've ever heard. We dated slowly. Carefully. With the kind of deliberate honesty that comes from knowing exactly how bad things can get when people lie. Jasmine showed me her worst self early, the workaholic who disappeared for days during editing deadlines, the woman who picked fights when she felt vulnerable, the daughter who still desperately needed her parents' approval despite pretending she didn't. I showed her mine, the men who checked her phone when she wasn't looking, just once, early on, until I realized what I was doing and apologized, the researcher who cared more about dying coral than living people sometimes, the son of a blue-collar family who still felt like an imposter in academic spaces. We were both broken in the ways people break when they've been betrayed and disappointed and taught not to trust. But we were broken honestly. And somehow, that made all the difference. 5 years after the wedding Jasmine and I got married. Small ceremony. No twins invited. Just our closest friends, my research team, her film crew, and 2 families who'd learned to love their disappointing children anyway. When the officiant said, "I do," I looked at Jasmine and saw exactly who she was: flawed, difficult, brilliant, real. And when I said, "I do," back, I meant it. Not because I'd found someone perfect or someone who completed me or someone who was everything I'd ever dreamed of. But because I'd found someone willing to be imperfect out loud. Someone who showed up as herself, messy and complicated and absolutely, undeniably real. That's what Olivia and Evelyn had never understood. Love isn't about finding someone who matches the fantasy in your head. It's about finding someone brave enough to stand in front of you without a mask and say, "This is who I am. The disappointing parts, the broken parts, the parts I'm not proud of. Do you still want me?" And having the courage to say yes. Not to the performance. To the person. 6 years after the disaster, I got one final email. It was from Evelyn. "Nathan, I'm not writing to apologize again or ask for anything. I just wanted you to know, I saw the article about your marriage to Jasmine. I'm genuinely happy for you. You deserve someone who could be real with you. I'm sorry it took you so long to find her because of what Olivia and I did. I'm in therapy still. Making slow progress on the whole, being a complete person instead of half of a twin thing. Olivia and I are speaking again, carefully, with boundaries, like 2 separate people instead of one fractured identity. We're trying. That's all any of us can do, I guess. Try to be better. Try to be honest. Try to be whole. I hope you and Jasmine build something beautiful together. You both deserve it. E. I showed the email to Jasmine. "Are you going to respond?" she asked. I thought about it. About forgiveness and consequences and whether time heals all wounds or just makes them easier to ignore. "No," I said finally. "I don't need to. She's doing her work, I've done mine, and we're both moving forward. Some chapters close themselves. That's very mature of you. Don't sound so surprised." She laughed and kissed me, and I tasted coffee and lipstick and the comfortable honesty of loving someone who was exactly who they claimed to be. No masks. No performances. No twins hiding in the shadows. Just 2 broken people who'd learned to be broken honestly. And that, I'd finally learned, was more than enough. It was everything.